This week's Tales from the Territories episode on Vice covered championship wrestling from Florida, Bloodstains in the Everglades, run by Eddie Graham, who during his wrestling career was kayfabe, the brother of Dr. Jerry Graham, who was Vince McMahon's favorite wrestler when Vince was a teenager. The same Jerry Graham who once kidnapped his dead mother's corpse right out of the hospital. But that's for a Dark Side of the Ring episode in the future. We got Steve Kern, Kevin Sullivan, Bob Roop, Brian Blair, and Jerry Briscoe as the roundtable for this episode. Roop was kind of quiet. Kern was great, though, telling his stories. A lot of big names came through that Florida territory. Dusty Rhodes, the Briscoes, and a very young, very green Hulk Hogan. And Briscoe told the story of the big guy with the blonde hair who would come to the show every Tuesday night. He was in a local rock band, this guy named Terry Bollea. They got him linked up with Hiro Matsuda to train him. Hogan was fighting back a little bit in the training session, which is when Matsuda, as the story goes, broke Hogan's ankle on purpose. And back then, they would do everything they could to run you out of the business. And if you came back, then they knew, okay, this guy is serious about it. A lot of guys didn't come back. Hogan did. And Jack and Jerry Briscoe, they helped Hogan out of the ring because they were there that day. They heard, Jerry said, we heard the crack, when Matsuda wrenched down on the ankle. So they helped him out of the ring. They looked down, they saw how black and how swollen his ankle was. They figured that was the end of this guy. But he claimed that Hogan called every day after that asking when he could come back and train, and eventually he did come back. Sullivan posed the question, what if Hogan never came back? Would the business be what it is today if Hulk Hogan had said, fuck this, I don't need this, I'm not coming back? Would the business be what it is today? I think the answer is yes. If it wasn't Hogan and Vince wanted the All-American babyface, he probably would have gone with Sergeant Slaughter. He would have overlooked the whole G.I. Joe deal, which is what led to their falling out. Maybe they don't do that first WrestleMania because, had they done it and failed, the company probably would have gone belly up. So maybe they don't, blow it up as big as they did with all the celebrities and everything, but Vince McMahon had the television slots locked down in all of these different... he was going market by market with a briefcase full of cash, paying to have them play his tapes and not play the other promotions. He had TV slots locked down in all these different markets. I think he would have expanded nationally. It just would have been a lot slower without Hogan. But what I found the most fascinating about the episode was hearing Steve Kern tell the story about his father being captured 2 different times as a POW. I did not know about any of this. His father is one of only 2 Americans to be held as a prisoner of war in World War II and the war in Vietnam. You talk about bad luck. Being captured once is bad enough, but twice. They didn't get into the details in the episode, so I did some research myself. He got shot down in his first mission during World War II. Very first mission, he got shot down. His parachute opened, but he hit the ground so hard he snapped both of his ankles. And he was held for a year as a POW in Nazi Germany. And then 20 years later, he got shot down in Vietnam, and they told his family there were no survivors in the crash. And for a year, he thought his father was dead. Until one day, they see this photo of him being marched through the streets of Hanoi. 8 years he was held and tortured there. And there's a great still shot of him running up to his father and giving him a big old bear hug when he finally flew back home and was on the tarmac and he was getting off the airplane. It's just an amazing story. Eddie Graham, he said, in some ways helped fill the void left by his father in those years, that his father was missing. Eddie kind of took him under his wing. But out of this came one of the hottest angles in the territory, which involved Bob Roop, who was a former army man himself, calling Kern's father a disgrace for being captured. Where have I heard that one before? But this whole angle was Kern's idea. Once he checked with his father first to make sure his dad was okay with it, and his father's attitude was, look, anything to help my son's career. He was fine with it. He said Eddie Graham never would have gone for it if he was around because it was too serious of an angle. But Eddie was away in Australia at the time. He had gone to Australia for a few months. He was trying to buy the territory down there, which ended up not happening, and the promotion down there went out of business. But Bob Roop got a dangerous amount of heat for the angle. He said he tried to stay out of public for 6 months after that. Unless he was going to work, he tried to stay out of public for 6 months. And he told the story one day. There was a guy in military, I don't know if it was fatigues or whatever, but a military guy pulled a gun on him, I think in a parking lot. And he said, as he was standing there with this gun pointed at his face, he said, well, I'm not going to attack the guy because if I reach for him, he'll probably shoot me. And I'm not going to beg for my life, I guess because he has too much pride. So he said, I'm going to turn around and walk away. And that's what he did. He turned his back and he walked away, hoping that if this guy is a military man, he's not going to shoot me in the back. And he didn't shoot him in the back. They covered the Army of Darkness stuff with Kevin Sullivan, who started out as a babyface and then he turned to this satanic character to play into the whole satanic panic of the 80s. You know, even in the 90s, I got into Dungeons and Dragons for like a hot minute. And I remember there being a lot of controversy around the game and parents thinking that it was going to turn their kids into devil worshippers. I guess my mother wasn't worried because she knew she raised a relatively well-adjusted human being who wasn't going to suddenly grow fucking horns out of his head by playing a game. I'm very grateful I had the parents I did for the time I had them on this earth. I never took that for granted because there's a lot of screwed up people in this country, let me tell you. I consider myself one of the lucky ones. But Sullivan told the story that, you know, one week it was him and it was Blackjack Mulligan. And this was an angle that Dusty Rhodes booked. They called this story the 1 week fight. Dusty Rhodes booked the angle involving him and Blackjack, where they would start fighting on the floor one night. And they fought into the lobby, and the fight went outside into the streets, and the fans are following them until the cops kind of forced them back inside. The fans. They forced the fans back inside. A week later, here comes Sullivan and Mulligan brawling back down to the ring in the same clothes the people saw them in last time. They're all dirty and everything, as if they had been fighting for the entire week. Because this wasn't televised or anything. It was just for the live crowd. And the last time they saw them, they were fighting out into the streets. And so here they come back again. That's why they call this the 1 week fight. Brian Blair told a ribbing story, because you can't have one of these episodes with at least one rib, that involved Pat Patterson and Pat's longtime partner, Louis Dundero. The two of them were together for like 40 years until Louis passed away in 98. Actually, Louis died the same night. He had his heart attack, I think the same night that Undertaker and Mankind had their Hell in a Cell match at the King of the Ring. But anyway, in this story, there's Patterson's car driving besides theirs. They look up and they see Louis mooning them. And so Jack and Jerry Briscoe, they're in the car with Brian Blair, and they tell Blair, who was probably the rookie at the time, you know, we got to get these guys back. So they got Blair to hide in the trunk of the car. Climbing into the trunk was a rookie mistake on his part. But he went along with it because he wanted to be accepted as one of the boys. And the plan was for him to pop out of the trunk at just the right moment and moon Patterson's car. But when Blair popped out of the trunk, they had parked next to the window of a local restaurant. And he ended up with his ass hanging out and his pants around his ankles and a bunch of people and families and kids. They're getting a show that they never asked for. I mean, these people were eating food, for God's sake, and this is what they have to see. So then to make it worse, the Briscoes, they drive off, and they left Blair all by himself. And on the next TV, I guess the story got around, because on the next TV, Gordon Solie, right, who was the voice of championship wrestling from Florida, Gordon Solie said, the people of Yeehaw Junction would like to thank Brian Blair for his public appearance. Then things got dark in the episode, a little dark. They didn't go too dark. I'll go darker here in a second, but they got dark when they talked about Eddie Graham's downfall. Eddie Graham had been a recovering alcoholic. He had not had a drink in 13 years. And when he was sober, they said he was fine to deal with. But when he drank, he was a lunatic. And he started drinking again. He had, I think, oh God, who was it? It was Brian Blair and Steve Kern, maybe. They were on Eddie's boat with Eddie. And they were doing this thing with beer cans where they like cut a hole in it and were holding it upside down so that the beer goes down your throat faster. Anyway, Eddie saw them doing this and said, let me try that. And that's what, I guess, knocked him off the wagon. He started drinking again. And they said it was just a steady progression from there, including one last crazy story in the episode here of him piloting his plane while drunk off of his ass through the nightly Disney World fireworks display, because they were in Florida. And every night, Disney World, they have this big giant pyro display. He drove his plane through the not over it, through the fireworks display. And Kern was on the flight with him. He was scared out of his mind that they were going to go down. They were going to get blown up. Somehow they made it out alive. But Graham was just a mess. And in the end, they were all very sad that Eddie, he lost everybody around him. They all left the territory. All the big stars, they all just went elsewhere. Most of his talent left for the Carolinas. They didn't get into how Eddie died or any of the tragedy with the family. But at the end of his life, the persistent rumor has been that he got involved in some sort of illegal land deal gone wrong. And he was very worried, not only about the money that he lost and apparently had to come up with, which was said to be somewhere around $500,000, but he was worried that if it came out, his reputation as this pillar in the community down in Florida would just be shattered. And he could wind up behind bars. But take your pick. I mean, there's been lots of theories about what caused or contributed to his suicide. It could have been that. It could have been the depression. It could have been his drinking. He had a lot of problems. But in January of '85, I think it might have been on Super Bowl Sunday, he shot and killed himself at home. Not before calling his son Mike to tell him that he loved him. And then he shot himself in the head. Fast forward to 2010. Okay, that was 1985. Fast forward to 2010, Mike's son Steven killed himself the exact same way, just 37 years old, shot himself in the head. And his friends said that Mike Graham, he never got over that. And then 2 years later, Mike Graham died the exact same way. Took his own life with a gunshot to the head. Not only that, but according to Kevin Sullivan, Eddie's father, so that would be Mike's grandfather, also committed suicide. And Eddie had a brother who I guess had terminal cancer, and he also killed himself. So when you think of tragic wrestling families and people taking their own lives, you think of the Von Erichs, right? The Von Erichs are the poster children for that. But the Grahams are right up there with them. So it got a little bit dark there at the end, but overall I thought it was another enjoyable episode. This Tuesday it is the Stampede Wrestling episode, and they got Bret Hart for the roundtable. So I can't wait to hear how Bret blames Bill Goldberg for the downfall of the Stampede territory.